So you guys remember I'm Russ Gallus. I have the privilege of being the executive director here at the museum. And tonight our speaker is Gordon Calhoun from the Great Lakes Naval Museum, who's going to talk about the birth of submarine history. And we have a slight technical problem. He brought his presentation on CDs, and the CDs were blank. However, he's here, and he's in my office he's retrieving the presentation, so we'll have him up, but we can get started. He said he'll be done in about 10 minutes, but just as a kind of an opening act, I guess, is what I am. A couple of things, just a reminder that we have this week, of course, we have Gordon Calhoun, who's here to talk about World War I, the birth of submarine technology. Next week, we have Fred Johnson back again, who's going to talk about and remember we had Fred last week, the impact of World War I on the world's psyche. And he talked a little bit about that last week, and he's going to come back and finish the rest of the story. Then in November, we have permission to show the movie The Lost Battalion. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. I have. It is absolutely a wonderful film that really will illustrate, now that we're getting all this history in true Hollywood form, but very authentic, actually. The use of mustard gas, the use of all these technologies, and you see the impact that it had on these brave men. And then on November 10th, we have the development of tank warfare, and we have Dr. Robert Cameron coming in from Fort Benning, Georgia, for that. A couple of things that I want to mention is thank you for everybody who became a member last week. If you're not a member, I highly recommend and encourage you to please become a member. It's a great deal because you don't have to pay $5. You get to come to these sessions for free. And we have a World War II lecture series I want to remind you about. And on the table on your way out, you can look at that. And we have some really wonderful sessions for our World War II series that starts in February and runs through April. And another thing, mark your calendars. You'll see it. Well, you'll see it on our website. But December 8th, we are in the process of getting permission to show a documentary called Voices of a Never-Ending Dawn, which is the story of the polar bears. I want to say the 339th Infantry with the 1st Battalion of the 310th Engineers and the 337th Ambulance and Hospital Companies were chosen from Detroit and Michigan areas. And last week, Burl Coldern was our sponsor, and he talked about his dad, Cleo Coldern, who was a polar bear. And another sponsor was the VFW Post from Fruitport. And so they were our sponsors last week. And we're going to we're going to show the movie and have a Q&A. That is December 8th. So hopefully, if the winter is anything like it was last winter, we can be polar bears while we learn about the polar bears. But a great story. And again, thank you to Burl for sharing that. Last week we talked about the World War I ended on the 11th month of the 11th day, but it didn't for these polar bears. They fought for 6 weeks. And then 6 months, and then some, after the war was over in Russia, in Archangel, Russia. And just an incredible story. I've seen the movie myself. I just watched the movie. So anyways, you'll be seeing more about that. But December 8th, that's a Monday, December 8th. And, okay, the last thing is still looking for sponsors, right? So if you know anybody that wants to be a sponsor, we have a couple of nights that don't have sponsors. I'm going to introduce our sponsor tonight because he has a few words to say about some projects he's working on and about his wonderful sponsorship, and it's a very meaningful sponsorship. Richard Mullally will talk in just a few minutes. But I did have to mention, Richard, I hope you don't mind, that last week I said if you became a sponsor, you get to drive the Deuce and a Half. So Richard was out earlier today in the Deuce and a Half, and he did a wonderful job. Just want you to know. It was a lot of fun. So if he looks a little ragged, though, you'll know why. His arms are a little sore. But that offer still goes, okay, before we put it into storage. If you become a sponsor, and I'll be glad to drive it. That can hold a lot of groceries. But sponsor sheets are up here, and we do need We have 2 weeks that aren't sponsored yet, so please, if you can give that some consideration, I would appreciate it. With that, then, I would like to introduce our sponsor for this evening, who has a few words about some of these men that is part of the sponsorship and some of the work he's doing, Richard Mullally.
Well, Russ gave me the opportunity to go for a ride, but I said, no, I'm used to driving a Model A Ford, so I'm sure I can handle this. My muscles on my sides, not my arms, but my muscles are sore. I'm sure I'm going to feel it tomorrow. Can you parallel park that thing? Oh my God, what an amazing vehicle. It's only given me much more respect for all of those men in both wars who served as truck drivers. They really know what they were doing. A couple quick announcements to get it out of the way. I don't even have to tell you the date, but Veterans Day coming up. It's again the annual Veterans Day ceremony. It's at the community college. They've asked me to be the speaker for a small part of it, and they said, we'll give you 5 minutes, and we want you to introduce quite a few World War II veterans. And I said, do you think I can do that in 5 minutes and then talk about something else? So they're extending it to maybe 10, possibly 15, but I've got 5 World War II veterans who are going to be there. Each one represents a different phase of the war, including a Pearl Harbor survivor, all the way to the end, to the Battle of Okinawa. So these people will not be speaking. They told me they don't want to. I picked people who can stand up and be recognized, and they certainly will. Now back to 10, 11 days ago. How many of you were on the flight, the Legends flight? I've recognized several. Okay, great. It was the thrill of a lifetime and a great honor for me to be a guardian. My man, won't even mention his name, he's been here in the past. He had a heart attack in September, and he figured, well, this is it, it's all done. If I even survive, I certainly can't go on the trip. Well, they got him back to normal, got his heart beating okay, and the doctors then told him, well, you've had a heart attack now, and we don't dare do your operation. They were planning to remove 4 parts of 4 organs for terminal cancer. And they said, we can't do the operation, but we can do chemotherapy, but we want you on that trip. The very next morning, he went in for chemotherapy. He was all smiles, and it was real joy for me and an honor to wheel him around and stay with him all day long so he didn't wander off. It was a wonderful event, and I hope if it happens in the future that you will be a supporter of that. When you see this, you might think, well, that's a World War I helmet. Well, you might be right, but you might be wrong. If you saw the movie From Here to Eternity about the Pearl Harbor attack, the soldiers were wearing these because the helmets changed after the war. They were using World War I helmets. So this is actually new. It was never used, and it was World War I issue, but was meant to use in World War II. Now, World War II, I'm transitioning from World War I to World War II because it was 20 years ago, just out of curiosity. I wrote a letter to the Chronicle and I said, do any of you know a living World War I veteran? Got plenty of people calling me. A lot of these were false leads because people didn't understand exactly when World War I was. But there were 4. And I'd like you to follow along on the handout so you can see the pictures. I'm only going to talk very briefly about each one of them because I want to transition into World War II. There were 4, but I had to go to 4 different counties to meet with them and interview them. This was not for any museum. It wasn't for any publication at all. In fact, until tonight, this has never been made public. I'm donating these reviews of these 5 veterans so the museum can have them for the future. But I was just doing it out of my own curiosity. I wanted to meet these men. My own uncle, Jim Mullally, whose land became Mullally Park, was a World War I veteran. He served in the United States along the Mexican border, most of the time on a motorcycle. I understand there was a man named Pancho Villa who needed to be watched down there. But these other men that I'm going to talk about all were over there. And you've heard that song and you know what that means. They were all in France. And we'll start with Rudy Johnson. Well, on your sheet, he's the first one. There's a Muskegon connection there. Do any of you remember the name Charles Hammond, a Muskegon detective? He was murdered by Dutch Anderson. In fact, they killed each other. Rudy Johnson took over. He became the replacement, and he spent most of his life in Muskegon. When I met him, he was in Grand Haven. Now, I'm not going to tell you all their stories because they're all right there for the museum to keep, the stories of what it was like over in France. The next one, Otto Scharmer. How many of you remember him? Otto Scharmer. He lived to be 105 years old. See, that's the only way I could find these people. I had to talk to people who were a minimum of 100 years old. I must have met him about 5 times. What a nice man. And his wife of 75 years spent his whole life in Muskegon. And he told his story too. Next one, Elmo Nobles. I don't know if he had any connection with Muskegon, but he was in Oceana County. He had a car dealership, and he had his own story about World War I also, which I wrote down. George Petropoulos. Does anybody remember George's restaurant in Muskegon? It was still going in 1956. He's part of the Greek restaurant history in Muskegon. He had 3 restaurants, and I know you've been to some of the others, and he had a lot to say. And this is like an extension of the talk last week with Burl Colburn's dad. They knew each other. They were in the same group. And this man had the advantage of living to be 102 years old. I met him just before he died in Fremont, and you can see he had the polar bear right in his yard. That was the first time I learned what the polar bear at the causeway was all about, because this man told me, and I was honored to meet him just in time. Okay, I was done with the project. It was 1996. I finished the 4 veterans, went on to other things, and then I got a phone call in 1999, 2.5 years later, from the Grand Rapids home, veterans home, and they said, you better get down here right away. There's only one of them left, and if you come, you can meet this veteran. Now, Fred Schubert had no connection with Muskegon, but it was an honor to meet him too, and he was 100 years old. So I knew that was the end, and it was the end. Now, I'd like you to look at the information on the card. You notice my card is there? I want to implore you not to throw that sheet away. Keep it. Keep it in your family, share it with your friends and relatives, because 90% of the World War II veterans are in the process of being forgotten. Most of them are already forgotten, except for just family members. I'm trying to save them from complete oblivion by making sure their pictures are in the museum. Now, veterans, raise your hand if your picture's in the museum. You too? Okay, 3,100. And sometimes they ask me, how much is this going to cost me? I say, you paid the price. You paid for this 70 years ago. What is in the museums, right, you know about this, you've got a few thousand of those. They're a 4x6 picture. They're in the computers. See, I didn't have enough with these guys. I decided maybe somebody should do this for the World War II people. And I want you to keep that card because that's the only way that you can spread the word to the people. I have no idea who they are. There were 20,000 who served from Muskegon County. I've only done 3,000, so I'm depending on you to talk to your family members, especially the older ones. Now, if you ask your great-grandchildren, they won't know anything. That's why I'm doing it, because they don't even know there was a war. But if their great-grandfather or great-grandmother is in the museum with a picture and a description, then they'll start to understand that they had a part of it too. So I'm hoping to hear from some of you or your family members, because I've got a lot of time on my hand and I need something to do. So keep me busy. A funny thing that happened today. I was talking with a widow. You know, there are a lot more widows around than there are widowers. I wonder why. Well, I found through the years, every one of these widows was married to Jesus Christ himself, the greatest man who ever lived. And now their veteran is in the museums. So I implore you to keep that, spread it on to somebody else, your neighbors and friends, and give me a call. Now, George Meniotis is not here tonight, but his better half is, and she wants to talk to you. Peg?
What I came to talk about tonight is all the wonderful donations that we've gotten so far on loan on World War I. This last week, we've covered everything from the infantry. I have information on several gentlemen from Muskegon area that were in the infantry during World War I. You think, okay, infantry is normal, but is it kind of funny to think we have the 1st Carpool Division in World War I, and several men from Muskegon were in the 1st Carpool Division. And you think, we've got infantry, we've got carpool, we have cavalry, and we have the 1st Aeronautic Division as well. And I'm thinking the dichotomy and the differences between all the different services that sprung up in World War I were completely different. If you look at all the wars previous to that, you have the infantry, you have the cavalry, but you don't have airplanes, and you don't have a motor pool in the trucks and all the mechanized forces. So it becomes a completely different war. And we've been lucky enough on loan to have one of the photos as well as his enlistment papers, his discharge papers, the very first set of wings issued to any group, as well as his first patch issued to the 1st Aeronautical Group during World War I. And that's really special because they're the ones who set the pace. And he has his letters writing home to his mother saying, this is the chateau that they billeted me in. It's different than home, Mom. And the complete difference that's there. And it's just an amazing thing to think. You know, these were young men. We look at them in these photos here, and we think they're all older gentlemen that have gone off to fight these battles. No, they were the 16, the 17, the 18, the 22-year-olds that went off to fight this battle. And they're writing home the same things as any young recruit would write home to his mother at this point. Hey, Mom, look at the cool spot I'm staying at. Look at what I got to see. Look at what I got to do. And you think about them and you say it's very incredible. Also, that we've gotten as a donation this week that is just absolutely amazing are the actual maps that someone brought with them to go to war in France. He was part of that carpool division, and so he had traveled in France previous to the war, and he brought his own maps. And they're the Michelin maps, and they are amazingly, they're made of canvas. They're almost indestructible, and they're from 1909, and they're still in perfect shape. And it's amazing to think. He also brought back, because he was a member of the 1st Carpool, their Christmas party for the Carpool Division. And to look at what they served and what they ate and what the young men did is just utterly amazing. I appreciate all the people that have made all these donations to us for the loan, because it really humanizes the story. The stories are great. We listen to the histories. We think so much of what's going on about all these developments, but we forget the personal aspect and think that each and every one of these is an actual young man that went off to war.
So it's really my pleasure to introduce from the Great Lakes Naval Museum, Gordon Calhoun, who is a historian there. I'll let him do his own additional introduction, but we also have the inside of the program. So very excited to learn about the history and evolution of submarine technology. So we'll have Gordon tell us, and then we can also take a look at what we have sitting in our channel here. So ladies and gentlemen, Gordon Calhoun.
Thank you all for having me. Just give you an introduction to what the Great Lakes Naval Museum is. The Great Lakes Naval Museum is in Great Lakes, Illinois. For those of you who are Navy veterans, more than likely you went through Great Lakes as your boot camp. Today it is the Navy's only boot camp. They have, some of you might have gone through Orlando or through San Diego, through the various base closing commissions. They decided the Navy was Great Lakes, Illinois, in North Chicago, Illinois, would be the only boot camp. And we are one of the U.S. Navy's official museums. There are 10 museums around the country, from the very largest one in Pensacola, the National Museum of Naval Aviation, to one of the smaller ones, and that's mine. We're in the process of putting a lot of money into the museum and getting it refurbished. We are and making it into something in quite exciting times. And what I'm here to talk about is the early submarine force going up to World War I. We cannot talk about the submarine force going into World War I unless we talk about the submarines themselves at the beginning of at the turn of the century. The submarines were, this is something, we hear other countries today building submarines that might threaten us. And one thing I have learned about technology is that you can build something, technology, but unless you have the experience to know how to operate it and know everything that could go wrong with it, you're not going to operate it efficiently. And this is probably the big lesson between 1900 and 1918, is that the U.S. Navy is going to learn a lot about submarines and all the faults that, how complex these machines really are. They look nice on paper, but when it comes down to actually getting it out into the cold Atlantic Ocean, things start going wrong, and things you didn't expect. You put it back in the overhaul, and they still don't exactly work. Up here, this is my introductory slide. That's how far we've come. On the left there, that is the USS Holland, USS A-1. And on the right there, that is USS Alexandria, named for my hometown, Alexandria, Virginia. For those of you from Alexandria, Louisiana, it was named for Alexandria, Louisiana as well. The Navy decided to be nice and name it after both cities. As a 13-year-old boy, I got to help see this submarine launch up at Electric Boat. How many have read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or seen the Disney movie? Of course, And I think they may or may not have that, Disney may or may not have that exhibit down at, hardly call it exhibit, but the ride down at the Magic Kingdom. But this book, I cannot understate the inspiration that this book, which was written in the 1870s, had on submarine designers later on. They read this book and were like, wow, we can do this. I mean, it was not just a fantasy. It was like, we could build something that could go under the water, and some people said we could use it to sink ships. Other people had more peaceful intentions, that we could go explore the oceans with it. No, even before Jules Verne came out with his book in the 1870s, he was probably inspired by little ships, little boats like this. These are the two Confederate vessels that the Confederacy came out with. The CSS David on the top, which was not a true submarine. It could not go underwater, but it was submerged about 80% under the water. And then the H.L. Hunley. Notice I did not say CSS H.L. Hunley. It was technically a privateer. Mr. Hunley funded the construction of the boat and ultimately went down with it on the third trip. The Hunley gets the distinction of being the first submersible to actually sink a surface warship in combat, and for the fourth time Hunley went down again. The boat has since been rescued out of Charleston and is under a very good conservation lab My last museum that I worked at, Hampton Roads Naval Museum, has artifacts from the USS Cumberland and the CSS Florida, both Civil War ships, and we sent several artifacts down to that lab as taking care of the Hunley. The David was, many people speculated about the name of the David afterwards. They said, well, it must be because of the biblical King David going up against Goliath, right? Well, the designer, who's named David Enbaum, got so upset that people did not know this that he wrote to somebody, he's like, know who that boat's named after? Named after me. I named it after me. Get it right, people. This is what, though, makes submarines possible, this weapon. This is the Whitehead torpedo. Started Mr. Whitehead in Britain, started work on this in the 1860s. A torpedo, the name torpedo comes from what we now call an undersea mine. Admiral Farragut's famous expression, we're on the 150th anniversary today of damn the torpedoes. He wasn't talking about this. He was talking about undersea mines in Mobile Bay, and that's what we would call torpedoes. We can come back a little bit to the David. On the front of the David there, that's what's called a spar torpedo. We start putting adjectives on the beginning of these torpedoes. And so this is now called a locomotive or automobile torpedo because it actually can leave the ship on its own power and hit its target. It carried 300 pounds of gun cotton, which was a pretty powerful punch. It used compressed air, 3-cylinder compressed air motor, and had a range of about 300 yards. Pretty weak by today's standards, remarkable by standards back in the 19th century. Everybody had been trying to come up with this type of weapon. Several American inventors have been trying to work on it, several German inventors, everybody. And in the end, they saw Whitehead's design and went, forget it, we're just going to copy his. The German came out with a design called the Schwarzkopf. For those of you who know German, that's the blackhead torpedo. No copy, they didn't copy it at all. What the Germans did differently was that this was made out of steel, the Whitehead was, and the German one was made out of copper. But the Americans dropped all their research work and said, they went to Mr. Whitehead and said, hey, can we buy your torpedo? Can we license production here in the United States? And he went, sure. And there was a company in Philadelphia that started turning them out and started making better ones. But every torpedo is going to be based off this. Now, what do we do with it? That's the question. What do we do with these things? The Navy was, at this time, and world's navies were concentrated on battleships. This was this is a picture of the Great White Fleet, which just got done celebrating the 200th anniversary of it. And the man largely we're not concentrating on little ships with little torpedoes. And it's because of this man, Alfred Thayer Mahan. His work, the influence of history upon sea power, is the most influential work upon U.S. Navy history, upon U.S. Navy thinking, and is still required reading and is still influential to this day. Maybe for the wrong reasons, but he believed, and his short answer in the book was, big ships win big battles. It could be battleships, it could be aircraft carriers. The submarine people in World War II, rightfully so, get very upset when they hear that they said the aircraft carriers won the Pacific War. Au contraire, they say, we sunk most of the boats. We've sank most of the ships, not the aircraft carriers. But it's still the thinking of Mahanian thinking. And so by 1914, we're still building bigger and better, putting a lot of money into battleship design, and everyone else is too. This is not just the United States. The British are actually in the lead, building what they call HMS Dreadnought, and all these ships now become called Dreadnought-type ships, because they're all modeled after HMS Dreadnought. And so we do build, but several countries, namely the French, somewhat reject the idea of Mahan and go to something simpler. They build a boat called a torpedo boat. It's a small ship, very considerably smaller than a battleship, maybe a tenth the size, and they come up with this idea that you could put 3 of those Whitehead torpedoes on this small ship, and one of those torpedoes could sink one of these battleships. And they always were gunning for the British at first, and British were always on the horizon there as an enemy. So that was the consider. It was a torpedo boat. So when submarines come around, they said, well, why don't we take the torpedo boat concept and put it below the water? And people are like, maybe that'll work. Maybe it won't. There are a lot of skeptics. Said that sounds awfully dangerous, and most people saying that's very uncivilized. That was, submarine warfare was very uncivilized. One person even likened to Guy Fawkes type warfare. You've seen Guy Fawkes is. Guy Fawkes was the conspirator in 1604 who tried to blow up Parliament with the gunpowder conspiracy. And he's considered one of the most dastardly figures in British history. And someone likened submarine warfare or any type of method to blow up a ship under the water as, you might as well be something Guy Fawkes would do. You got to fight, like men and fight above the surface. But fortunately enough, there were people like this man, George Dewey, and his dog Bob. And what's funny about the name Bob, this is the first chow. One of my side projects is animals and mascots in the history of the U.S. Navy. This is probably one of the first chow chows imported into the United States. Dewey got while he was in the Philippines. After he won the Battle of Manila Bay, he picked up a chow chow on Hong Kong. And it's a blue chow. And most people today, including my mother-in-law, who has a chow, name their chow chows Chinese names, something really fancy. Dewey just named his Bob. But Dewey believed, and Dewey was coming out of the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War is in 1898, and he is chairman of the General Board. This is the principal advisory group to the Secretary of the Navy, and he is the most famous military officer anywhere in the United States because of what he did at Manila Bay. I mean, New York State's giving him houses. The Republican Party wants to put him on the presidential ticket. They promptly kick him off the presidential ticket when they find out, well, who's that woman coming into your house? Is that your sister? No. Yes. Yes, they kicked him off the ticket for that. But he remained a very influential military figure. And he said to the General Board, if there were he looked at submarines that were being considered and said, if the Spanish had 2 of these boats in Manila Bay, I would not have one. That was enough to set things in motion. We're in a time period where there are no bad ideas. There are a lot of critics. There are lots of papers being written in Naval Institute proceedings and some of the popular weeklies about why this guy's idea is no good, why this idea is no good. But the Navy, surprisingly, is willing to entertain anything. They're willing to entertain more monitors. The USS Monitor, original USS Monitor was built in 1862. Civil War is 30 years over, and guess what? There's still people think that the Monitor-type warship is the way to go. We don't need to build battleships. We need to build more monitors. So they built some of those. Someone said, hey, why don't we fly a plane off of a ship? That's an idea. And people thought that was totally crazy, too. This is Eugene Ely, the man who did not know how to swim and was deathly afraid of the water, pulling off that feat for the first time. And then on the far right, my particular favorite experimental ship, the USS Vesuvius. This is a ship that did not use gunpowder to fire its guns. It actually had the largest guns in the world. They were 16-inch guns. It was a wooden ship, too, a completely unarmored ship. It used compressed air, similar to firing a torpedo tube, to fire a 16-inch shell out of its barrel. They used it in the Spanish-American War, and actually, on paper, was actually quite effective, because the enemy never knew when the shells were incoming, because they never heard a gun. There was no fire coming out. There was no explosion coming out of it. They decided in the end, no, it was not a good idea, and they didn't, but they were at least willing to entertain the idea. They were even willing to entertain an idea of a ram. They just built this one purpose-built ship with no guns on it and just had a hardened front, and its sole idea was that the enemy came into harbor, it was going to go out there at full speed and ram another ship, just like the Romans and the Greeks did, 2,000 years before. I mean, this is the day we're thinking of. There are no bad ideas. And so in this era, these two men come along. Submarines are welcomed. Maybe mocked a little bit, but they're at least welcomed into the submarine experimental program. Like I said, there are no bad ideas. And these are the two gentlemen who come to the top, come with the two most serious proposals. John Holland on the left, an Irish immigrant who wanted to create, and a hardcore Irish nationalist, who really conceived the ideas of building submarines to building submarines in the United States, to take them back to Ireland and fight the Royal Navy in the name of the Irish Republican Army. And the gentleman on the right there is Simon Lake, who was his principal competitor. Both gentlemen had over 100 patents to their design before they were done. Simon Lake in particular had over 200 patents, not all devoted to submarines. He was a brilliant engineer in many different phases, but submarines was one of his projects. And he mentions in one of his books that Jules Verne's book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, that he read at age 12, directly influenced him to get into the submarine business. He said, wow, we can do this. And he said he even went to a pond immediately after reading the book and said, well, how can we make this work? How can we get something to go down into the pond and come back up again? This is what John Holland came up with. It was a very practical boat. It had something called a dynamite gun, very similar to what the USS Vesuvius had. When the Whitehead torpedo came out, was perfected, and the United States bought it, the Navy said, well, why don't you put torpedoes on it? That would be the most effective way to this weapon to be of any use. Among the people who were in charge of USS A1, this boat had different names to it. USS Plunger, USS Holland, and eventually they settled on USS A1 to be the A class of U.S. submarines. And among people, the lieutenants to command the submarine was none other than Chester Nimitz. He was coming out of the Naval Academy, and one of his first assignments at sea was to command a submarine. And he commanded several of the early boats. And so by the time he becomes admiral in the Pacific War, he is quite familiar with what submarines can do. Here's Simon Lake's idea, much more complicated. And like I said, Jules Verne himself should have invented this thing. It had wheels. It could go on the bottom of the ocean. We could use it to explore things. His idea was more the SEALs would love this boat. The Navy SEALs, Special Operations, would love this thing. And that's the idea he kind of had in mind, that this boat was not meant to, we don't use a torpedo per se, that we would go and put mines underneath ships. We'd use it to cut cables, underwater cables. We would have lockout chambers, and we would be able to cut harbor nests, and really a lot of complex things. And the Navy looked at it and said, this is just too complicated for us. And Simon Lake was very bitter about the whole procurement process. In his books, he kind of called Congressman's crooked, the Secretary of the Navy's crooked. And so he's actually ready to give up until one country, the Russians, are like, we're interested in your boat. And the Americans are not. The Russians said, we're interested in your boat. When can you get them over here? And so Newport News Shipbuilding, the shipyard that is responsible for building aircraft carriers today, builds 8 what they call Protector-class submarines for the Russian Navy. And so the Lake Torpedo Boat Company gets started. John Holland, with his boats, they are built at different shipyards, and eventually partners with a startup company called the Electric Boat Company, and who kind of, I don't want to say stole his patents, but they did lease his patents. And Holland tried to go overseas to sell to market his submarines, and Electric Boats stopped him. Lake was a much better businessman than Holland was. Holland was an engineer, was a humble engineer, did not know much about business. And Electric Boats stopped him from trying to market his boats overseas. And we exclusively have rights to your patents. And there is USS A1 with the signature of Nimitz at the headquarters at the Navy History and Heritage Command, which is the command I worked for in Washington, D.C. They have several pictures of the early submarines, and several of them have Nimitz's signature, personal signature on them. He served on this little craft before he went into bigger and better things. This is the boat. I have a whole sheet of stats. If people want to know about the stats of these things, I have the stats. The initial Holland submarine, the initial one was only 74 tons. This one here is 107 tons surface and 123 tons submerged. So we're talking about a very little craft here. But they went, and they procured 8 of them. And they initially gave them fish names. But someone decided, well, I don't want a fish name. We want to be like the British. The British named their submarines after just a letter and a number. And so they dumped the fish name idea and for naming of the boats, and went simply to, this is the A-class submarines. There's USS A1, A2, all the way through A8. And then eventually there's going to be the B class. And then the C class and the D class. And they skipped a couple letters, but that's the system they're going to use well up through World War I. This is one of the D-class boats. Four River Shipyard helps build some of them. They do farm out some of the work. Some of the work goes out to the West Coast, but they realize these are coastal defense submarines. These are not what we call fleet submarines. Meant they are, the doctrine was that they would only protect the harbors in case of an enemy battleship started to show up. The lesson learned was something like the War of 1812, where the British were able to park their ships off our coast and be able to raid our coast with impunity. And so the submarines would be there to shoo off any enemy battleships or any surface warships. The crew for these submarines, by the way, is about 3 officers and 25 enlisted. And I'll get to a little bit toward the end about what kind of men they wanted for these submarines, at least what the doctors said. But one person wrote, said, the United States Navy, the submarine has never been popular. It is indeed by no means certain in comparison with other navies that the United States was not better off with underwater boats in 1911 than she was 3 years later when the war breaks out. The bulk of our naval opinion has always been for dreadnoughts. And this is kind of unfair because everybody, even the Germans, were going for dreadnoughts. Big surface ships were the way to go. I'll talk about when World War I breaks out, and these are just the German flotilla. The German submarine force is what brings the United States into World War I because of their unrestricted warfare. Now here's the rub. The Germans had all of 30 boats in 1914. The British had 80. We had 40. The French had 60, and we're building a lot more. And so we actually outnumbered the Germans over close to 3-to-1 in terms of submarines. Now the difference is, though, is that a submarine is not, to say a submarine was going up against another submarine was somewhat misleading. The concept of a killer submarine didn't really, as a doctrine, didn't develop until the 1950s. But they always still thought of those terms, that, well, we have to match our boats with what the other countries are doing because there's no other way to measure it. Because that's what they did with battleships. But the Germans started out with only about 40 boats. Some of those not exactly working, some of those were experimental, some of those were just for training purposes. But by the end of they kicked their war production into high gear, and by the end of the war, they're going to have 350 submarines built in just 4 years. The Allies together sink about 170 of them. They soon realized, especially after 1915, that in the 1950s when the Battle of Jutland happens. The Battle of Jutland is when the British had their big, this is the way my mentor at the College of Worcester described the Battle of Jutland. The British built a big fleet, took 20 years to build a big fleet. The Germans took 20 years to build a big fleet. They came out, blasted each other, and decided the last 20 years was a waste of time. Went back to their respective ports and never came out again. And these were 25 battleships and battlecruisers on each side. They came out and blasted each other and said, no, and never came out again. So the Germans decide, well, we're not going to win the war this way. And the submarine people are influenced the Kaiser enough to say, give us unrestricted warfare against Allied shipping. He gives it to them once. The United States threatens to declare war, and they back off. And then they say, look, the Americans are going to come into this war whether you like it or not. Let us loose. And so the Kaiser does. And then this eventually is one of the direct reasons that Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. By unrestricted warfare, we mean there is no warning. Restricted warfare, or what's the traditional cruiser warfare model was, you came upon a merchant ship, you boarded it, please kindly get off your ship, we'll take you to a safe neutral port, and then we'll either capture your ship or we'll burn your ship on site. Now that worked for the 19th century, the Age of Sail, and somewhat even what the Confederates even would by those rules with their successful cruiser campaign during the American Civil War. Not going to work so as practical in World War I, especially with the advent of the aircraft or with other surface ships. These boats are very small. They're 150 to 200 tons. It would just take 2 or 3 shells to sink it. And that's what the British ended up doing. The British ended up seeing a German submarine on the surface. They just started unloading it. They didn't wait to say, are you, what are your intentions? And so eventually the Germans said, fine, all bets are off. We're going to go unrestricted warfare. We're going to sink any Allied ship or even neutral ship approaching Ireland or England. For all the effort and sacrifices made on land, is the German U-boats who are going to win this war. When the Admiral Sims, who becomes the U.S. Navy's commander-in-chief of American forces in European waters, asked his British counterpart, so how bad is it? He went, we have 4 weeks of food left. That's how bad it is. So the first thing they send over, when the United States sends over, is destroyers, ASW craft. The destroyer, to show that no, not every ship was intended, this design was intended for its original purpose. The destroyer was originally meant to sink torpedo boats. It was called a torpedo, the full name was called Torpedo Boat Destroyer. And it was meant to go after the torpedo boats because we're so afraid of torpedo boats. Eventually, it was not meant to go after submarines, but they're like, well, this seems like a good enough craft to do it. Why not? So Desron 8, you'll see the painting in several books, and I strongly suggest you go look for it online. It's called Return of the Mayflower. It's a very dramatic painting of the very first American combat units enter the war. Desron, Destroyer Squadron 8 out of Norfolk, entering Queenstown, Ireland, with Irish fishermen going, yay, Yankees are here. There's an actual photograph of the event. It's a lot less dramatic. Artists like to, don't call it artistic license for nothing. It's sea state of 0. It's flat water. No one's there to greet them. But the painting itself is really dramatic. The original is at the U.S. Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis. When the war is going on, Simon Lake, he's back. He's not ready to give up on the U.S. Navy. He turns out something called the G-class submarines, and he advertises this. He is a major marketer. He believes he can create a boat, what the Germans did. Let's not have these coastal defense submarines. Let's have a submarine that can go across the Atlantic, around the world. Remember, Nautilus from 20,000 leagues? Let's make a boat that can do 20,000 leagues. And so he creates the G-class submarines, which is the most advanced, on paper, it's a very advanced submarine, and he does an anonymous, and I'm convinced Simon Lake wrote this article himself, but there is a special to the New York Times article that touts all the advantages of the G-class boat in 1915. And it says, and the inventor says, blah, 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 blah. I'm sure Simon Lake wrote that article for the New York Times to say how great the G-class submarines are. The problem with the G-class submarines are, and this is a problem with a lot of the early boats, is the power plant. They initially use gasoline-powered engines, and then eventually do not use diesels. They use gasoline-powered engines and the rechargeable batteries, and eventually switch over to the diesel, a diesel engine for more power. But all these submarines have a problem with that diesel engine, and it keeps breaking down when it gets out to sea. The G-class in particular were notoriously breaking down. They would send them out there for 2 days. They would break down, and they would have to tow them back, overhaul the whole thing, and it would break down again. And the Navy was just like, look, this is just not what we want. But so the U.S. Navy the submarine people are adamant that they want to get involved in this war. The destroyers are sent over to Queenstown, Ireland. Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom, so at this time, so they are using naval bases out of Ireland. The cruisers are being used to escort troop transports across to transport the American Expeditionary Force across to France. And the submarine people, who most senior officer on any division is a lieutenant, has to go to the newspaper saying, we won in this war too. We can do something. We can sink U-boats. And people are like, oh, you can sink U-boats. And this was not a totally crazy idea. The British had this idea of, well, we have all these submarines sitting around. The Germans are not bringing their surface ships out. Why don't we try using submarines to sink U-boats? And it was a very interesting idea, so that they would go out on patrol. They would submerge to about 30 feet, just periscope depth in the North Sea, look around, and if they saw a German U-boat on the surface, they would shoot at it. They would also sometimes employ a decoy. They would put a sailing schooner out there with a telephone cable attached to the submarine that was submerged, to the British submarine that was submerged. And the schooner's watches would say, all right, we see a German U-boat surfacing to attack us with a deck gun. And then the British submarine would go around, get in firing position, and shoot. They successfully sunk 2 U-boats this way. Americans are like, see, the British are doing it. We can do it too. And so Admiral Sims says, yes, get them over here. We need these submarines. With Admiral Sims endorsing, Admiral Sims is a very forceful personality. He's only a 3-star. He's not Chief of Naval Operations, but he is a very forceful personality upon what the Navy is doing in Europe. And after the war, he's going to get in trouble for that. He'd say after the war, there are going to be a series of investigations about Admiral Sims and how cozy he was with the British, even though they aren't friends, but at the time. So one submarine squadron goes to the Azores. This is the island of Fayal. I can tell you, I just did a talk in the island of Fayal about the War of 1812. If you ever want to go on a most beautiful vacation spot, this is the place to go to. But they sent 5 submarine boats, K-class submarines, along with one of those monitors. What are we going to do with these monitors? Monitors make great subtenders because they have almost no freeboard at all, and they're right on the water line. They have a huge storage capacity, so it's very easy to ship supplies over to the boats. So these monitors get new life. They also have two 14-inch guns on them. And the case of the island of Fayal and a couple of the other Azore islands, the Germans did attack the islands with their submarines. And the Portuguese Navy did nothing about it. It actually was the American Navy. At first, it was an American freighter that did the first shots back at a German submarine in the Azores. This is an American, one of the civilian freighters had a couple of guns on it, and they started shooting back at the Germans. And when the Americans showed up with submarines and this monitor, they were ecstatic. The Azore Islands were always very friendly, and they still are very friendly to the Americans because we have a very long tradition with them. Our whaling ships had stopped there out of Boston, had stopped there. Their crews had served on these whaling ships. We taught them how to whale. And so when the Americans show up here in 1917, they're ecstatic. They're glad that the Americans are here. There was a concern because the that the Germans were putting pressure on the Portuguese to back out of the war. The Portuguese had sent 50,000 troops to the front lines. They were battling the Germans down in Africa. And the Germans are trying to put pressure on them, like, look, you don't need to be involved in this mess. By the way, can we have the Azores as a sub-base? That was a huge concern. The Germans now would get a sub-base out in the Azores are in the middle of the Atlantic. And it would be a very, very effective sub-base for them. So with the American presence there, that deters the Germans from ever trying to take the island. That is the U.S. and the submarines worked with other surface ships. This is the USS Margaret. I showed this picture for several reasons. First of all, this was the view I had every morning out of my hotel. This is on the other side there. That is the volcano Pica. That is one of the islands of the Azores. All the islands of Azores are volcano islands. And that is the USS Margaret, which was one of the rich millionaires' yachts that the Navy procured. And then between the 1890s and 1918, the Navy procured several of these yachts, and many of them were well designed. Not this one. The USS Margaret was pretty bad. The USS Margaret actually went looking for a German U-boat that was sighted. Came back, didn't find it, and then they were told, oh yeah, we just intercepted a German transmission from a U-boat, and it said, found U.S. patrol boat, not worth sinking. Then the main force went to Queenstown, Ireland, the L boats. Now, I say L boats, you say, hey, they say AL on it. Well, this was to prevent confusion with the British L boats. The British had L boats as well. And so we agreed to paint an A on every one of our conning towers so as not to draw any kind of confusion about the British or American. Now, I'll talk about it later, it would not matter because the British had standing orders, British ASW forces, whether they're planes, destroyers, or what have you. If you saw a submarine, you shot first and you found out who it was later. And so I'll talk about a little bit more of this a little bit later. That's USS L2 there in Queenstown, posing for the camera. They are also very well received. Once the Americans really built up their forces there with the destroyers and with the submarines, the British just pulled out. The Royal Navy moved their units elsewhere, and Queenstown basically became U.S. Naval Station Queenstown. We set up a base there, we set up a logistics base there, and everything. And actually, we were very well received by the Irish.
Name a carrier after Mr. Nimitz?
Because he's Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, and he is one of the most important admirals. Carriers come with their own strange naming system. Politics really gets involved with the naming of carriers. There is no, they kind of had a system with the WASP, with the at the beginning with using patriotic names. They had Ranger, WASP, Hornet, naming after War of 1812. But then we start coming after World War II, you start naming them after the leaders, Forrestal, and then there was a Ranger, there was an America, and then you have John F. Kennedy, and you start naming after presidents. And then Nimitz rightfully deserves to have had a carrier named after him. They're not going to do another Enterprise. CVN 80 is in designing right now.
My son was an officer
on the Nimitz, okay.
And I've been on the Nimitz many times.
Now, they switch over to the fish names, like Silversides, and with the after the war, they finally dropped this letter number name and eventually come to the fish names. And then then Admiral Rickover changes the idea to cities. And someone asks why. He says because fish don't vote, cities do, was his famous line. And so they come up with the Los Angeles class submarines. And I can tell you how effective that is with the USS Alexandria. My father was state senator from representing Alexandria, Virginia in the Virginia General Assembly, and he was, and every other local politician was invited up to the electric boat, and it's genius. You build local support for cities that normally would never know about the Navy to like the Navy. You get treated, they wined and dined us and everything about it. Of course, we had to share the limelight with Alexandria, Louisiana. It's the first and only time, I believe, shipboard submarine has been named after two cities. Even though, and I made the case Alexandria had Virginia had much better claim to the name because we had been a port since 1749, and Alexandria, Louisiana was a small port in the Red River. But never there. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Nimitz's background going back to World War I. Did Admiral Lockwood have any submarine service?
That I don't know. I'll look that up. That's something. I know several of the admirals did. I believe Hart did. That's why he was so intrigued by it. Several of the admirals in World War II. I know the commander of Submarine Division 8 in Queenstown, Ireland, not Submarine 8-5, is a lieutenant commander. He goes on to become the commander-in-chief of submarine forces in the Pacific. And so many of the junior officers in World War I cut their teeth on submarines before World War II. I'm just trying to find out which ones now.
Well, the Nimitz was in Norfolk, Virginia.
Yes.
That's where you were from.
Yeah, that's where I worked. Yeah, I worked there for 19 years for the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, which is one of the other Navy's museums, which is slowly switching over to the National Museum of the Surface Navy. The Navy is switching to more of trying to do a national focus and not just a regional focus.
But now it's out in Seattle, right?
Now it's out in Seattle, yeah. We have no more, one of the problems the Navy's facing right now, we have no more conventionally powered carriers. And so they've always had four carriers based in Norfolk, one in Florida, 4 in San Diego, and 1 up in Seattle. And so there's now the 1 in Seattle. Yeah, yes, they are.
I have a curiosity question.
Yes.
How do they cook and store the food there?
That was a complaint that the surgeons noticed as soon as they got on there. They asked the same question: how do they cook? There's nothing to do.
There's no refrigeration.
There's no refrigeration. There actually is one of the sailors is a cook. They actually did at least give them somebody who knew how to cook.
Can't do a fire.
No fire. It would be cold food. And wait till you get back on shore.
That's why they had that problem.
Yeah. The Navy doctors mentioned this, that you can't cook. The officer, there's so little room, they mentioned, that the captain who's supposed to do all this paperwork and write out these deck logs and things we've done today, he said there's one desk, and there's one folding desk and one chair that he can sit in to do all this paperwork. That's how cramped quarters are. So for the World War II veterans, it could have been worse. No.
Can you tell us a little bit about your museum? Is it open to the public?
It is open to the public. It's one of the Navy's, like I said, one of the Navy's 10 museums. All Navy museums are free and open to the public. The museum right now focuses on the history of Naval Station Great Lakes as it was built back in 1906 and eventually used and as the Navy's primary boot camp. And the buildings there, all the buildings at Naval Station Great Lakes are historic buildings built in 1917, 1918. Captain Moffett, who's one of the leading proponents for aircraft carriers between the wars, is brought in specifically for his hard-driving attitude to whip this base into shape, to whip Naval Station Great Lakes into shape, because we have 20,000 sailors come through there in just 1 year. And then today it is, most of our visitors actually are families coming from out of town for Friday graduation. And, we have, on Mondays, our attendance is up maybe 10, Tuesdays 10, Fridays 500. Because what happened, we do catch the crowd that once the sailors are once they graduate, They march them out by a company to meet their families one by one. Well, there's about an hour lapse between that. And so we're like, well, come inside and see us. We can tell, and we actually get this, they actually ask the question, so what did my son or daughter just sign up for? And we get to tell them in a nice way. We tell them what they went through with boot camp in case they're not willing to tell them. And in some cases, we have volunteers there who went through Great Lakes. They'll tell them, well, this is what they went through in World War II. So they have it much easier today. And also, Great Lakes is also where a lot of the advanced schools are. The A schools, the C schools are. The bosun mate school is there. The fire controlman rate school is there. The newest one is the SEAL prep school of sorts. It used to be that SEALs were picked from the ranks. Now they have a special rate for SEALs, and anyone who an 18-year-old says, "I want to be a SEAL," it's like, well, before we send you out to Hell Week out in California, we're going to run you through Hell Week in Great Lakes first. We'll run you through basic training first and see how you muster. Then we'll send you to Coronado, California, and then they'll really treat you rough, and then you'll see if you can cut it to be a SEAL. So that's one of the newest schools at Great Lakes. Some of them have been merged, like there's no longer, the corpsman school is no longer there. All the services have now jointly have one medical corpsman school down in Texas to train, so everyone gets the same basic training. Though Navy corpsmen have the special distinction of actually going into combat as well. And that's become a speaker at my last museum. Her job was to train, to try to indoctrinate psychologically the Navy corpsmen. You thought you were going to be at bedside with casualties. No, you're going out with the Marines in combat. And to try to psychologically prepare these corpsmen who didn't think they're going to be shooting a gun. Oh yeah, you're not going to be shooting a gun. You're going into combat. You're going to have to save the Marines, and the Marines respect them greatly for that. Yes, sir.
In the big scheme of things, between how effective the submarine corps was during World War II, how effective were they really?
Not that, operationally speaking, not that effective at all. We sunk exactly 0 boats. The destroyers and the airplanes did all the work. However, you got to start somewhere. And that's what every technology, every brand new technology has got to start small. It is a learning experience. I call this the foundations of the force, and that's really what it was. They have to learn what to do. The British would actually teach them. The British and the Americans exchanged notes about, well, how do you train your sailors? And the British said, well, we have something called an attack simulator on shore. And they would train them, this is how you see a surface ship coming across, don't shoot at them, shoot ahead of them. And they're like, oh. And the Americans are like, that's how you... So the British taught us a lot on how to actually operate a submarine in combat. And we brought back this attack simulator idea back to New London, back to the submarine base, back to sub-schools. Oh, this is how you attack a surface ship. Germans knew how to do this. The British knew how to do this. Because we weren't going to send submarines into combat initially. No, they didn't tell them how to shoot properly. But the British did. The British told them how to shoot it and what depth and things and that sort. And you want some going shallow, maybe one going deep. They did.
It still didn't work.
Yeah, it still didn't work. No, and it was a learning experience. So, yeah.
You said the Germans had 350 submarines by the end of World War
They built 350.
How about the Allies?
The Allies built, let's see now, the British had 80 at the beginning of the war. They built about 30 more, and same with the French. But then they realized we don't need submarines, we need destroyers. We need ASW craft, we need freighters. We need things to bring supplies over from the United States. So they stopped building theirs. And also the French submarine force mainly was in the Mediterranean doing battle with the Austrian-Hungarians. And they were assisted by the Italians. But not the Austrian-Hungarians were able to slip through and sink a couple Italian battleships. Most of the battleships sunk in World War I were sunk by submarines. Both sides, where the British got a few, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians got a few, but yeah, most of them were sunk by submarines. And so I think everyone got a healthy respect for submarines during the war, so much so that that's why when the London Naval Treaty came around in 1930, there was a huge peace movement, especially in the United States, to just get rid of submarines, ban this weapon, ban this uncivilized beast from warfare. You know, along with chemical weapons, why are you getting rid of chemical weapons and gas? Get rid of the submarine too. And no one was willing to go that far. The officers on every country were like, no, 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 this is a good weapon. Don't. All right, limited size. They did have to limit their size in the 1911 London Naval Treaty, but ultimately the pacifists lost out. That they wanted, they were able to convince Congress and the negotiators in London that no, we really want to hold on to the submarine. The Japanese in particular were like, no, we love the submarine idea. I don't know what you guys are talking about. we're keeping them. And of course, the Japanese are keeping them, the British are keeping them, and everyone else is keeping them. The Germans were the only ones forced to get rid of it, and that was because of the Treaty of Versailles and how much damage they did. They're like, that's your first punishment. You're going to give up every one of your U-boats. Give them to us so we can look at them.
On that same vein, you talk about the Whitehead torpedo and how the Germans kind of copied that.
Yep.
Was there any technology that the German U-boats used from either the Americans or the British?
I don't think maybe the initial one. It's funny you mentioned that. I'll start with the British first. All right, remember how John Holland wanted to build boats to blow up British ships? The British looked at Holland's boat and went, hey, that's a pretty nifty weapon you have there. Can we buy some? He went, sure. So much for Irish nationalism. No. He actually sold his designs to the Royal Navy. In the end, that's where he made a lot of his money. He sold out the Irish cause, I'm sorry to say. And several people did look at the Holland boat as a good starting platform. And said, they call them pig boats because they look like these pungy little things, not this sleek design that we have outside here. They look like these pungy bathtub type things. But everyone looked at that and went, that's something, may not be the best boat to build, but that's something to build on. We can work with that. And so yeah, the British buy some, the Japanese buy some off that design. And then so yeah, I don't know if that Germans actually bought any Holland boats, but they certainly looked at them. But the Germans, when it came to things like periscopes, they're still the best. They're the best at making optics, always will be. People just came up initially with a gasoline engine, from cars, and then eventually they went to diesel because diesel was more powerful and more fuel efficient. I think the Germans came out with that first. And then we saw that the Germans were adopting that, and the British said, It's interesting that the British adopted the submarine as much as they did. They're concerned about the German battleship fleet, and so they build up a big battleship fleet, but they also build up a big submarine fleet, twice the size of the Germans. And I've never read anywhere going, so where are you actually going to use this thing? What surface navy are you going to attack? And because they wrote in their manuals, we're going to attack battleships with this thing. What battleships? Because they even had a picture of one of their own, like, this is the target. Like, what, you going to attack your own battleships? This is from a 1911 publication. One of the senior British admirals, who was a big-time submarine person, said, yeah, we're going to attack battleships. This is the target. And he showed HMS Warspite. Yes, sir?
Battery technology must have really advanced during the...
Yes. The concept of a rechargeable battery is invented and used. So that's how we're going to submerge. I mean, the propulsion technology, you're correct, cannot be understated. Because before the Great White Fleet battleships, they're offering off coal-fired boilers. Some guy, some port slob sailor, is shoveling coal into a hot boiler, sometimes several tons of it, to make sure that ship can keep going, and his boilers can keep going. When a submarine comes around, now the CSS David does have it does use steam powered. Hunley is all hand cranked, and most of the submersibles of that early time period are hand cranked. Even the U.S. Navy in the Civil War that come out with the Intelligent Whale and the less discussed Alligator, those were both, the propulsion was hand cranked. You have a bunch of guys going like that as your propelled. Alligator was a total disaster, and that's why we don't mention it in the book. It's surprising how little the Alligator is mentioned in books. It sank 3 times, all in the Potomac River, to which one officer is like, no, this is a dumb idea. It's just not going to work. And eventually it's sunk under tow, and they don't know where it is right now. NOAA went looking for it. The friends at the Monitor Marine Sanctuary, who watch over the remains of the USS Monitor, went looking for it, and I don't think they knew exactly where they were looking, but they said, well, it's somewhere off the coast of Hampton Roads, and they never did find it. So that's one of those many shipwrecks yet to be found. And it does look, it was developed by a Frenchman. And it's a cigar shape with a nose in front of it, and it was quite the ingenious design. Just it had to be, it could never never come up. I always kind of say there are two things very important for these submarines. They got to go down, they got to be able to come back up too. There's that old joke that every ship can be a submarine once. I had a great joke, which there's something going around the internet. It says adage: never give a warm-up period to a submarine captain before you put him on a surface ship. And it says a ship bow first going into the water. It's actually a ship that was purposely sunk, but no, that's what the surface Navy people like to poke fun at the submarine people. Of course, the submarine people like to come back with, I have pictures of you having a smoke break on the deck of your ship, which they do, especially with like the Enterprise and Nimitz aircraft carriers. During exercises, German submarines in the 1980s were taking pictures of the captain. Like, that's how close they got. I mean, with diesel submarines, the Germans, most countries do not use nuclear power. They're using conventionally powered submarines, and they're still that quiet and that dangerous of a weapon. And that's why we would correctly invest so heavily today in submarines, because they're a very, very effective weapon. You've been very kind. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Mr. Calhoun, and thank you all for coming. Next week, I invite you to stay for coffee, cookies, and conversation. And Dr. Calhoun, or Mr. Calhoun will be here to take any other questions you have. Next week, the World War I, its impact on the world psyche. So thanks for coming out. Bring a friend next week.